Hey, how's it going, guys? This is your boy Hazzed, and today on the 8.2 PTR, we're going to be taking a look at some recent Frost Decay changes that could open up some certain doorways for us to give us kind of some interesting builds when it comes to both PvE and PvP. So let's go ahead and jump into this video and talk about it. So let's go ahead and start talking about some of these Frost Decay buffs going on. We're going to start off obviously with Frost Strike. Now this ability is basically increases both main hand and offhand damage by 4% attack power, which really doesn't sound like much, but in the terms of overall scaling, since it is based off of percentage of attack power, it's also based off of the amount of strength or mastery you can proc up during the Frost Strikes to increase the overall damage, just stack up to be quite a bit, so that extra 8% Frost Strike damage in the end is going to be a lot bigger than noticeably it just looks like on paper. So that's going to open up a few doors for us to actually rely on Frost Strike when it comes to both Azurites or just overall DPS when you're going to burst, and give us a little bit of an opening way to deal extra proc burst damage on the target that I'll get into a little bit in the future that we currently didn't have. And realistically, that was one of the main issues with current obliteration is when it comes to dual wield, generally your biggest burst reliance comes with Frost Strike. Since you actually have to consume runic power and choose between using your healer damage, Frost Strike generally with dual wield is significantly higher than obliterate damage, which wasn't something that we were granted here in Battle for Azeroth, which is very weird that we didn't. I don't know what the decision was to go about that, but I really just didn't feel like it was a good one. But this is going to offer us a way to actually go back and rely on Frost Strike when it comes to PvP at least, and we'll be able to deal some quite a bit higher burst damage because of it. Next up, we got the Breath of Sindragosa nerf, which is being brought from 52% attack power. Again, keep in mind this is attack power, which scales heavily down to 47% attack power, giving a total of a 5% nerf to this spec. Now, I did expect a nerf to Breath of Sindragosa, and here's why. All the changes they've recently been doing to Frost Decays is pushing us towards either the obliteration spec or previous change that we'll talk about next is the Icecap spec, which essentially is the same thing as the obliteration spec without the guaranteed crits during burst. But because of the essences we're going to be able to use on the 8.2, crit's gonna be, essentially the least of our worries when it comes to DPSing on a target, so we're not really gonna have to worry about that very much. And this is also gonna grant us ways to branch out and play other specs when it comes to Mythic Plus and hopefully single target Mythic rating. With the current changes that we've seen, I can definitely see an Icecap build pulling ahead of Breath build when it comes to overall DPS because of the essences and of course this Icecap change. Next up, we got the Icecap change. Basically, Icecap beforehand, whenever you got a critical strike with obliterate or Frost Strike, it would reduce the remaining cooldown of your Pillar of Frost by 1 second. Now it's going to be reducing the remaining cooldown of your Pillar of Frost by 3 seconds, which is going to give us a much longer burst window. Now you're probably thinking, it'll probably cool it down by a couple seconds, not going to be a huge deal. No, this is actually a huge deal for both PvE and PvP specs, and we'll go ahead and jump into some of the specifics right now. So when it comes to Frost Decay PvP specs, this is one I've been wanting to be able to play in a viable way for a very long time in Battle for Azeroth, and I believe this is actually going to give us the opening or the damage we need with this spec to actually make it somewhat viable. Is it going to be the best spec for Arena? Most likely not, since survivability when it comes to a Frost Decay is key, but the Frost Strike damage increase overall will improve that anyways. So talking about this spec, the major difference is going to come with the traits that I'm going to be using when it comes to dealing large amounts of burst damage on a Frost Decay. Because generally I was going to stick with the, let's see if I have them in my inventory here. The PTR vendor actually is not on the PTR currently, but luckily I've still got a bunch of random Azurite traits that I can mess around with and test out different builds. Like seriously, just about any build I want to. So generally, before these changes were made, I was going to be running, let's say, the Icy Citadel Frozen Tempest build, which I'll still probably be running when it comes in terms of Mythic Plus or single target DPS. That's not going to change when it comes to PvE. But our damage, obviously, in PvE is going to be overall increased when it comes to Frost Strike damage because, I mean, you can't go wrong with the damage increase when it comes to consistency. And that also brings me to another thing with Frost damage increasing. It's also going to make using Breath less of a priority when it comes to DPS. So talking about those two talents, the reason I didn't want to run these anymore is because the sheer amount of crit we're going to be granted, and of course the extra proc damage from Frost Strike. And what I realized is if I actually just went to the Latent Chill build, as you can see on my items on just about every one of them, I've got Latent Chill and I've got Trade Winds. And the reason being is, of course, whenever you have at least 3 empty runes when it comes to your Frost Strikes, it's going to deal more damage, which of course is going to stack with the damage increase of our Frost Strike already. The next thing I'm going to be using is Trade Winds. Now this ability is kind of hard to use the majority of the time since it does have a low proc chance, but when it does proc, a single Trade Winds ability can increase your Frost Strike damage by 25%. So if you've got 2 of them like I do, not on that piece, actually my shoulders, I've got Latent Chill and again Trade Winds, that's going to increase my Frost damage by 50%. Literally my Frost Strikes are going to hit 50% harder than they would previously, and of course I've got Latent Chill on both of those, so they're going to hit 2,000 if it crits 4,000 damage higher than it previously would. Now you can see how this damage is starting to just stack up like crazy when it comes to the Frost Strike. Now I wish I did have one of them on my chest piece. I couldn't test that out, and that would increase the Frost Strike damage by another 25%. So just massive Frost Strikes when it comes out and you time burst and let's say you runic dump on a target. And again, Latent Chill again, just to increase our Frost Strike damage as much as possible. So essentially, what is this going to do? This is going to give our Frosty Case a way to actually burst a large amount of damage on a target that we previously weren't able to do. Now, the main reason that this spec wasn't necessarily viable before the 8.2 is the Azurite neck pieces, because this Frost Strike, even though this would do a lot of damage, it was almost impossible to get crits with this build. You see where this is going, guys? If you watched the last video, you know exactly where I'm going with this. And of course, the Azurite neck piece is going to cause us to be able to proc an insane amount of extra crit chance on the target to increase our crit chance to what, like 70% what it was on the video. So essentially, the ability that would cause us to do, 60 to 70k Frost Strikes was only seen once in a blue moon, but with that new PTR neck piece increase, this spec is actually going to have insane consistent burst damage. Now, if we train this spec and we put it together also with Icecap, we can forget about Obliteration right now. And the reason why Icecap's so strong is essentially if you get enough crits, think about this, if you get enough crits with Obliterate and Frost Strike, because that's going to be our main bursting priority, you could essentially chain your pillars together with enough crits. So with that Azurite neck piece, essentially you're going to have almost 100% uptime when it comes to using your pillar burst. So we mix that with the low amount of chance of Trade Winds. What are the chances that you're going to be able to line up Trade Winds with Pillar of Frost? Essentially, it's almost going to be harder to not line them up than to line them up. So you're going to time your burst when you have your crit up, when you have a bunch of runic power, when you throw up your Pillar of Frost, and you're just going to keep continually rotating on the target until you get those correct crits. And if you runic dump at the correct time, you're essentially going to be hitting 4 to 5 Frost Strikes that could hit from anywhere on a player target from 30 to 40k plus damage, which is going to be an insane amount of burst chance or burst damage when it comes to playing a Frost DK in PvP. Next up, we need to talk about the PvE side of things with this Icecap change. Now, obviously, the PvE traits I'm going to be running is Frozen Tempest and Icy Citadel. So with the new change to Icecap and the fact that you can almost chain Pillar of Frost together as it currently is, and we're not even using the big crit buff from the Azurite neck piece that we could be using, it's going to actually just shorten that distance of pillars by a lot. Like, you're going to be able to chain these together fairly close. Now, if you know the ability Icy Citadel, whenever you get crits with your Obliterate or Frost Scythe, it's going to extend out a strength buff, and if you're running 3 of them, it's essentially going to be 3,000 extra strength for however many seconds you manage to get extra crits. So 6 seconds plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 based on how many crits you get. If you can extend that out to 12 to 15 seconds, which is obviously going to be fairly easy when it comes to using that Azerite neck piece, when you're able to just get an insane amount of crits during your downtime, it's going to just increase our overall DPS by quite a lot. Now, if you're able to extend that out by 12 seconds, and after your pillar falls off, you only have 8 seconds until your next pillar, it's going to grant you an opening for you to get 3,000 extra strength on top of your next pillar for a small amount of DPS. And during that opening window, it could give you a lot more proc damage on Cold Heart and Frostworm's Fury, since both of these abilities are based off of AP, kind of like Frost Strike is. So it's going to scale heavily the larger amount of strength you're going to have, and those crits are going to just skyrocket extremely high. But in terms of PvP, obviously these things don't hit for crud, so don't use those in PvP. But in terms of PvE, when it comes to single target sustained damage, whether or not Inoctable Assault, the non-critical strike granting stacks, is going to be less or more than this kind of the new version of Cold Heart coming out. So we're going to have to see exactly where the distance between those two talents are going to be. But obviously, this is going to be fairly interesting in terms of PvE. Now, the reason why we can't completely test that out currently is because the neck pieces have been disabled while they're doing raid testing on PTR. So sadly, we're unable to test that out at the moment. But overall, this is awesome in terms of PvE. This Icecap buff is insanely strong. A lot of people are going to look at this and think, it's not that great, but having a Pillar of Frost constantly rotating and having your burst up all the time instead of a big 45-second window is going to be a world of difference inside both PvE and PvP. So I'll go ahead and start off and show you guys exactly what I mean about the PvE side of the DPS, since I'm sitting on this character right now. So the thing to notice here is how fast Pillar of Frost is going to come up in comparison to what it previously was. DPS right now is fairly irrelevant with this spec, since we'll be running the Essence neck pieces, which is the overall bread and butter when it comes to doing high DPS with this spec. It will seem uneventful, this kind of damage, until we get that, because that's really going to be what makes this whole thing kind of pull together. But this spec obviously works fairly well on live too. But it's not going to be nearly as viable as it will be in 8.2. So watch how fast this Pillar of Frost comes back up. It's going to be absolutely insane. And of course, whenever you have Empowered Rune Weapon, it's going to be even faster. Like, it's going to be a lot faster when you just have a ton of runes to be able to spend whenever you want. So I'll go ahead and open up on this target. Obviously, we're using Icecap, so we don't have to use a Howling Blast in the beginning to proc up a guaranteed critical strike on Obliterate. So let's go ahead and start off on this target. We're going to go ahead and run up on it. We're not going to be using Remorseless Winter right now, just because it doesn't really matter. We're going to be aiming for those big crits. As you can see already, we have a little bit of downtime there. We're going to go ahead and use our Empower to do a little bit of extra damage. Pillar of Frost is coming down to 1 second, and already we're halfway through the cooldown. We've got 1 second left on yeah, our pillar fell off. We actually have the extra 3,000 strength. The 3,000 strength just fell off with 5 seconds remaining. Think about that. 5 seconds remaining. If we had the extra crit chance from the Essence neck piece, there would have been no cooldown. We would have been able to pre-proc up that pillar before the extra strength buff of our Azerite traits was capable of falling off, essentially giving us a much larger amount of strength than we previously would be able to get. And that is what I'm actually excited about when it comes to the next patch, is how much damage we're actually going to be able to deal by chaining our Pillar of Frost together. Like, this is an insane amount of extra consistency that we're going to be able to gain throughout a fight when it comes to this single target, not Obliteration spec, but Icecap spec. So next up, I'm going to be showing you guys kind of like the PvP traits going on here that I'm actually just extremely excited to be able to play on live. Hopefully it stays in. So this is going to be the giant Frost Strike build. Latent Chill obviously increased Frost Strike damage, and then of course the extra Mastery proc that we're going to have. And since we have an insane amount of uptime due to our Icecap, we're basically going to be bursting all the time. So lining up trade winds with our burst is not going to be the hardest thing in the world, especially when we get our Azerite neck piece going. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys some of the damage Frost Strike here is capable of. The highest Frost Strike I've gotten on a DPS dummy was a little bit over 70,000, and on a player, the highest one I was able to get was about 35 to 40k, which I believe is going to be a lot more easy and it's going to be a lot more noticeable, of course, when we're able to get that neck piece and just guarantee our crits essentially on the targets when we're runic dumping. But I'm going to go ahead and open up on this target kind of like I did the other one. And the thing with this spec when it comes to Empower Rune Weapon is it's like a Power Rune Weapon is kind of a double-edged sword, because you want to be rune starved, and that's what's going to give you a lot of your major damage when it comes to using Frost Strike. But on the other hand, what's the problem with having runes since you got a better overall rotation? But with this spec, I'm mainly just looking for that big Frost Strike damage burst so I can blow people up when it comes to battlegrounds or things like that. Just damage they usually aren't expecting from a Frost DK when it comes to PvP. So I'm going to go ahead and open up on this training dummy. I'm going to throw up my pillar, open it up, and I'm just going to open up with Obliterate. Since again, I'm not running Obliteration, I'm running this OP Icecap, because you can't go wrong with this OP Icecap. It's actually pretty insane how strong this is going to be coming into the next pack, especially with that neck piece. So coming in with the pillar, we're going to go ahead and open up with our Obliterate, just kind of a normal overall rotation. I should be using that proc and just trying to runic starve ourselves. And right here is when we're going to start dropping the Frost Strike. It's during that little downtime. You saw there we got a 27k crit. Wasn't that big. We did have up some minor bursts, but we didn't have up trade winds. Trade wind procs just after falling off of our major burst. We're going to go ahead and throw up Empower just so we can get to our next pillar a little bit faster, hopefully before trade winds falls off. Double proc on trade winds, that is insane. That thing is so weird sometimes. Like, it wants to proc and then it doesn't proc, and then it wants to proc and then it doesn't proc. It has, trade winds has a mind of its own. So essentially you want to stay rune starved as much as possible and drop the largest amount of Frost Strikes you possibly can on the target. Now in terms of Remorseless Winter, it will increase your overall DPS, but for this spec it's not necessarily as important. You can see there we got a 28k Frost Strike. Keep in mind these 28ks and 27ks that you're seeing is just one hand of the weapon. It's not both hands. So why that one's critting for, 28k, the other one could be critting for, 17, 18, 19k on the target, doing insane amount of damage. On average, without the crits, you'll hit for like 20k Frost Strikes, which is a lot of damage coming out on the target. I'll go ahead and switch up this DPS meter so we can go ahead and look at some of this Frost Strike damage. As you can see there, my Frost Strikes are actually towering over the rest of my abilities when it comes to just damage in general. We're going to go ahead and just keep up Rune Starvation there and just keep dropping these big Frost Strikes on the target. And realistically, you don't really have to pay attention too much to your buffs. You could if you wanted to, if you really were going for that, like, all-together Frost Strike damage. But overall, it's not necessarily that important. But we'll go ahead and take a look at this Frost Strike damage. You can see there, the highest one we were able to connect with our main hand was 30k. And see, that's like the major downfall of this spec currently, is not having that neck piece and not having the ability to get those Frost Strikes, even though we're lining up cooldowns. But that critical strike chance increase is going to absolutely change this. Now, if we look at our Frost Strike damage and our offhand Frost Strike damage, accumulative, we're hitting for about 45k on that target, which is about the average, I'd say, burst crit damage. That would be probably 25 to 28k on a player target, which is fairly strong. But if we put these damaging abilities together, we're actually doing about 34% of our overall damage in just pure Frost Strike damage with these two abilities. So you can see that that is also going to scale heavily when we're able to get that overall crit damage or crit increase on our neck piece. Now, the other thing we didn't even talk about this entire video was Blood of the Enemy. Now, Blood of the Enemy increases your overall crit chance. I believe it was like 25%, and then it increases your crit damage by an extra 15%, which is going to add even more burst damage to our Frost Strike ability, essentially making it hit for almost 80k. Now, if I was able to get another trade winds on my chest piece, you would easily be able to hit for an 80k Frost Strike with Blood of the Enemy, obviously the secondary neck piece ability, so you have just 100% crit, and of course another trade winds on your chest piece. Now, on a player, that's going to be like a 50k crit. It's going to be absolutely insane when it comes to Frost Strike. So what do I think about these changes, guys? I'm stoked for these changes. I'm stoked for the Icecap change. I'm kind of sad that Obliteration didn't end up being a bit better and they didn't change it up so Obliteration, let's say, procs an extra 15% damage to Obliterate and Frost Strike, something along those lines. But overall, I do like these changes. I do find them pretty cool, and I do think this is going to open up a lot more doors for us as Frost DKs in both PvE and PvP to run a few different things and have kind of a bit of style to what we're doing on our Frost DKs instead of just being that same old bland breath spec that we're running. So again, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed this quick little update. I noticed a lot of people have been talking about it, not really sure what exactly is going on here, whether or not it's good, whether or not it's bad, but I hope this kind of puts that idea to rest. So leave a like if you enjoyed this video, guys. And a quick thing before I go ahead and head out here is I got to talk about like the intro and outro. For some reason, there's a company just like on a rampage right now, and they're harassing the living crud out of other content creators. And for some reason, they keep flagging my intros and outros, which I'm either going to have to mute them when they do that, or I'm just not going to have to use them at all. And I haven't really decided exactly what I'm going to be doing about that on my videos. I haven't really decided, do I just use a different song? Are they going to hit that song too? I'm not really sure. But again, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you did. And of course, until next time, this was your boy Hazzed.